Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this podcast, we talk about the stories behind songs and artists, as well as moments in history and history in the making. Today, I am so excited to come to you to tell you one of my favorite stories of all time. Next to the story behind the song White Christmas, which is another episode that I've done, I will link it in the corner and in the description down below. Similar to that story, I really love, and the story of Auld Syne. I've done the story behind that song as well. I'm going to link both of those because they're sort of along the same page as this holiday season. And there are a lot of similarities between this story and the story behind the song Auld Syne and the story behind the song White Christmas. I love each one in their own way. So if you want to go on a little rabbit hole or a little playlist edition, you can watch all three of these episodes leading up to Christmas. Also, my dog is in the background and she wanted to say hi. So I tried to move a little bit so that she could. And now she's not looking at the camera. Hopefully you're watching this on YouTube so that you can see my dog in the background. I also have these episodes available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Pretty much anywhere that you can find a podcast, you can find this. However, I really try to push people towards the YouTube channel because it's just better in a lot of different ways. But I will go ahead and load this episode to the podcast feeds as well, if that is more your style. I will briefly summarize this story first, and then I'm going to go in and dig into the details of the story. But I just want to summarize it in the beginning so that you know what we're getting into. Because basically, the song Carol of the Bells, well, let me back up for a moment. If you follow me on Instagram, you would have seen that I recently had the absolute honor of attending the White House Christmas Ball. It was actually my first time going. I went with someone who had been gone every year for like the last 15 years. So he was totally used to it. He's done them a million times before. I've been at the White House before. I've been in DC many times, but never at Christmas time and never to see Melania's decor. It was just beyond breathtaking. So if you followed me on Instagram, you would have seen that. And you also might have caught, or maybe it slipped your attention, you might have caught that we also spent the afternoon at J.D. Vance's house leading up to the ball that was going on in the evening. While we were at his house, before there was like a transition period when we went from inside the house to the outdoor patio area. As we were going into the outdoor patio area, the U.S. Army was there caroling a cappella, and they were singing the most beautiful rendition of Carol of the Bells. It was just so perfectly executed.
Once it's to hear words of good cheer from everywhere, filling the air. Oh, how they love raising the song, joy and thrill, telling their tunes. Yea, they ring while people sing songs of good cheer. Christmas is here. Ding dong, ding dong, that is a song. Ring, ding, ding, dong, ding, ding, dong.
And so beautiful. And their energy and their facial expressions were so perfect. It gave me chills. It gave me goosebumps. And I knew I needed to dig deeper into this story and bring it to you, my Roots Music family, because I knew the basis of the Carol of the Bells, but what I didn't know and what I learned in my research was that the original composer of Carol of the Bells, he was a Ukrainian. He was Orthodox. He came from 3 generations of Orthodox priests in a very small village in the Ukraine. He was very pious. He did the whole original composition of Carol of the Bells. Most of the credit goes to him. Another person came in who I will talk about in this episode who changed the words, but he really is the man behind this song. He was actually assassinated at his parents' house just days after the Feast of the Nativity. It was so sad, and the Russian government tried to cover it up. No surprise there. But the files pertaining to this assassination were not released to the public until the 1990s. And once they were released to the public, it became completely evident that this was a Czech, a secret Soviet policeman who carried out this execution as a straight-up assassination. And it is so deeply saddening because this composer was not even a political force. He wasn't even involved in politics. in his area, but he was passionate about music, and he was passionate about preserving Ukrainian music, preserving the Ukrainian culture, and he was a very pious Orthodox Christian believer, and he was assassinated for all of those reasons. He was not a threat by any means, but the Soviets thought that anyone who stood for Ukrainian freedom was a threat and wanted to take them out, especially if someone was well known and had status in society, which the composer of the Carol of the Bells, the original song, he did. He had status, he had notoriety, and he was taken out brutally and tragically. So this is the full story behind that man, how he wrote Carol of the Bells, and the events that not only led to his tragic assassination, but how the song grew and reached global audiences following his death. One of the saddest parts of the story is that he never lived to see the song do so well. But we are here today with this incredibly famous song, this incredibly famous piece of work, and you will be hearing it throughout the Christmas season, throughout the Hanukkah season, throughout December and January. You will likely be hearing this song. So I think it is really important to know the story behind it, and I hope that you enjoy this story as much as I enjoy telling it. As I stood there at J.D. Vance's house just a few days ago, in 2025 is the year, I was thinking about how this song that I'm listening to right now has its roots going all the way back to 1916, when it was originally composed by a Ukrainian man named Mykola Leontovych. Mykola was a very handsome guy, by the way. I must say, this is a photo of him, and you can see he just looks really nice, like a really good guy. Mykola was born on the exact same day, actually, that I got the idea to write this episode. So I felt like the stars were a little bit aligned here. He was born on December 13th. The year was 1877. He would actually pass away, he would be assassinated brutally only 5 years after writing this iconic and timeless carol. Mykola was born in a very small village called Selavinci. He came from several generations of priests. His father was the Orthodox priest in the village, so was his grandfather and his great-grandfather. Both his father and his mother were singers and filled the home with music on a daily basis. Mykola was the oldest of 5 surviving siblings, so not only was he the first child to really become immersed in the family's music and faith, but he was also often the sibling that the others would look to for guidance. Not only when they were all playing and singing together, because Mykola was often the lead in all of those sessions, but his siblings also always came to Mykola on a regular basis simply for guidance and for life advice. All of Mykola's siblings actually grew up to have full-blown careers in music, but in 1892, Mykola decided he would follow in his paternal side's footsteps and go to seminary school to study to become a priest. He enrolled at the Podolia Theological Seminary in a town very close to his village, the closest, biggest town. I think it was called Podilski, but I don't know how to pronounce it. But this was the same school that both his father and his grandfather had attended. So he was very excited to pursue this path in seminary school. While he was studying there, music still remained a huge part of his life. He mastered the violin by this point, but he also played the flute and harmonium, and he also sang in the seminary's choir. During his 3rd year at the school, an orchestra was formed, and he immediately joined it and played the violin. Fun fact that not many people know about me, but I actually played the violin for several years in school. I was first chair, violin, actually. But back to Mykola, because it's not about me. It was also during his 3rd year at seminary, Mykola started to study music theory. He began writing choral arrangements. At first, it was just for fun, but soon, this hobby started consuming him. And there's a funny story about him actually sneaking out of school for a few hours, not to do anything bad or naughty, but even though it is naughty to escape school, but he actually left to attend the opera that was in town. He did get in trouble for this because you were not supposed to leave. But I think if he was going to leave for anything, leaving to see the opera is such a wholesome, rebellious thing to do. And Mykola's peers knew this about him, and they also knew he had a gift. Back then, they didn't really sign yearbooks per se, but when you graduated, your friends would write on various photographs that had been taken from that year. And for Mykola, his friends wrote on his photograph when they addressed him, they said, quote, "To the glorious composer." More than one person said that when they went to sign his photographs. While Mykola very well could have gone into a professional career in music immediately upon graduating, he actually decided to not go into music like his siblings and to not go into the priesthood like his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather. In fact, Mykola decided to become a teacher. In September of 1899, he began his very first teaching job. He was teaching singing and arithmetic at a secondary school in another close-by village. He wrote a book about his early teaching days. The book is called How I Organized an Orchestra in a Village School. Very straightforward and to the point. But in this book, he talks about how bad of a teacher he was, which is sort of funny. It wasn't what he was meant to do, that's for sure. He went into the wrong profession there, just a little bit, but that's okay. 2 years after his attempts at teaching, it was obvious to him this was not the right career path. But he ended up taking another teaching post, thinking maybe it was just the school, maybe he just needed a change of scenery, maybe he could be a teacher, maybe he was cut out to be one. So his second teaching post was at a theological college, where he taught church music and calligraphy. So he kind of dropped the arithmetic, thought maybe I'm just not good at math, maybe I'll just focus on music and writing. There, at the second teaching post, he also organized a choir, something that didn't exist before he got there. Not only did he organize a full-blown choir, but he also organized an orchestra amongst the students as well. This theological school was beyond grateful for Mykola and his contributions to the music there. The choir and orchestra he created not only covered the works of various well-known composers, but they also played a lot of the songs Mykola himself had composed. Now, at this point in time, Mykola was 24 years old. He had been earning money at a good, stable teaching job for a while now, so his next life endeavor was certainly to meet someone and settle down and have a family. Well, his dream came true in 1902 when he met his wife, Claudia. Claudia was the sister-in-law of one of Mykola's colleagues, which is how they met. Mykola and Claudia wed within that same year of meeting each other, and also within that same year of being wed, Claudia gave birth to their first daughter, Halina. And later, she also gives birth to a second daughter as well. While Mykola and Claudia raised their new family, Mykola continued to teach at various institutions and contribute to the choirs and orchestras there. One of their longest stretches of residency for Mykola and Claudia was their residency in a town called Tulchin. This was a pretty big town, especially for that time period. In the 1897 census, the population was about 15,000, so you can kind of guess that when they lived there, the population was probably around 20,000. There is a pretty big gap in the census because of World War I, so there was a census in 1897, but the next census didn't come around until 1926. So we have to guess, but 20,000 for a population back then was a pretty good, lively town. Now, the time Mykola and Claudia lived there at the peak of Mykola's kind of creative burst, that was really around like 1914. And around 1914, Tulchin was firmly under Russian imperial rule, meaning any Ukrainian publications or cultural influences like music, church events, and education, they were all very severely restricted. There were no books being printed that, advocated Ukrainian culture or the Ukrainian Orthodox traditions. Church events were limited, and you certainly wouldn't be singing Ukrainian songs openly on the sidewalk, knowing that there were Soviet policemen around there to kind of yell at you if you were doing that. The Ukrainian culture and music was really focused around the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as you can imagine, and a lot of Mykola's musical influences came from liturgies within the Orthodox Church. He actually contributed to a lot of the songs that were sung in the Orthodox Church during that time. Now, the only reason Mykola and Claudia lived in this village, in this town, under this Russian rule was because Mykola had a wife and children, and he had to take care of them. He had to provide for them. And this town really provided the best teaching opportunity for him. He recalled in his book how he faced incredible pressure and censorship from the Russian government. He says how he was always under their watchful eye and that they were monitoring what publications he was putting out and what type of music he was conducting. But that didn't stop him from holding true to the Ukrainian Orthodox roots and to continue producing that type of music, trying to maintain it and trying to preserve it as best he could. Now, Mykola didn't know it yet. He knew he was under censorship and he knew all of this was going on, but he didn't realize that these were the beginning days of World War I, and things were going to get a lot worse. Now, Mykola was an incredibly observant man. He always kept up with the news and what was going on, so he was very much tuned into these political tensions going on, years even before they really began to take root. The time he spent in Tulchin is critical to this story because this 10-year period saw the uprise of political tensions, but also served as an enormously productive and creative time for Mykola. He was inspired during this time. It's estimated he began writing what would become the Carol of the Bells in 1910, about 2 years after he moved to this town, and that he fine-tuned it and really finished it up around 1914. But of course it wasn't called the Carol of the Bells in 1914. Mykola called this piece Shchedryk, which was a Ukrainian word that translated to meaning generous or bountiful. This word was often said around New Year's as a wish, wishing a bountiful new year, which back then, this is important to the story too, back then New Year's would have been later in January because they were going off of the older calendar. And because of that, as you can imagine, January is very cold. And especially if you have farms, which most people had farms, most people were living off of their crops. January was sort of a scary time for them because it was a lull in the weather where they were waiting for spring, waiting to see what would happen, waiting to see if there would be storm after storm after storm come warmer weather. The Shchedryk season was that period right after the Nativity, which in the old calendar was the beginning of January and before the Epiphany. So it was a season, but it was also a word that meant something too. The first masterpiece of this song, like I said, was finished around 1914. Once it was finished, it was only 4 notes and was really catered towards an a cappella arrangement. Even though Mykola had all of this experience with orchestras and the violin, he really wanted the song to be a cappella because he wanted it to feel. It sort of reminds me of the story behind the song I Will Always Love You when they were directing Whitney Houston on how to sing it. And he insisted that the beginning of the song I Will Always Love You be a cappella because he wanted you to feel that emotion. That's how Mykola felt with this song Shchedryk. He wanted it to be a cappella so that you could really feel that emotion. Now, Mykola didn't write the melody from scratch. He actually took the melody from an old folk song and chant that was often sung in rural Ukrainian villages, especially in the farming communities. And this chant began with the words, Shchedryk, 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 I think I said that right, which directly translate to little generous one, and then Shchedrykova, I know I'm saying that wrong, but the kova part refers to the season, the broader tradition of wishing well, wishing bounty. So Shchedryk, Shchedryk, Shchedrykova, like bountiful, bountiful, bountiful season, something like that, right? Now, again, back then, the Ukrainians were following the old calendar. So their Christmas and nativity feast was January 6th and 7th. And then the Shchedryk New Year's season would have been more around like January 13th or 14th, or that week after January 7th, before the Epiphany, before the Theophany on January 19th. This is all based off of calendar and date mythology that many Orthodox churches still actually follow to this day. I know many Ukrainian Orthodox people who still follow this calendar. I know many Russian Orthodox who still follow that calendar. These dates are really important to emphasize, and they end up bringing up so much more meaning to the song later on in the story when we also start to talk about Mykola's assassination and the timing around that. But just to continue a little bit on the early renditions of the song, this was a farming song sung in the farming communities, and the song was taken from that traditional folk song. Then Mykola masterfully layered onto it this beautiful choral texture, which creates this like tension and this rhythmic ostinato, meaning a repeated musical phrase over and over and over that just sounds so pleasing to the ear, and you can't stop listening to it. It's almost addicting. Mykola had made the acquaintance of another Ukrainian composer and choral conductor named Alexander Koshatz. Alexander and Mykola were about the same age. Alexander was just 2 years older than him, and Mykola really admired Alexander's career path and his work. So Mykola actually reached out to Alexander directly and asked Alexander if he would conduct his song, Shchedryk, with his orchestra in Kiev. A lot of people think Mykola's song was first performed at Kiev University in mid-December in 1916, but it was actually first performed at the Kiev Merchants Assembly Hall later in December of the new calendar year. And it was conducted by Alexander and Alexander's choir group around like December 29th. They wanted it to be more of a New Year's concert song. Now, everyone who was in the audience at that assembly hall realized this little folk song that had seemed to be just a modest and local tune to Mykola had the potential to be so much more and to be much more widely known, especially now that Alexander was conducting it with his orchestra. This was a big deal. Alexander had a bigger orchestra and a bigger audience being in Kiev versus the town Mykola was in. Now, right around the time Shchedryk makes its debut in Kiev by Alexander, Mykola and his family decide to move to Kiev. They did this because Alexander let Mykola know that there were work opportunities in Kiev, and they were good work opportunities. They paid more, they had more exposure to different audiences, and most importantly, they paid more, and Mykola had a family to support. So once a job became available for Mykola at the Kiev Conservatory, he jumped on it, and he said, "Claudia, kids, we're moving to Kiev." Now, for Mykola and his family to move to Kiev in 1918, this was disruptive. This was a disruptive, risky, and very emotionally heavy move for them. But it was also full of hope and prosperity. This is where also there's some misunderstanding. Mykola had no direct involvement in the October Revolution that's about to happen, or the establishment of the Ukrainian People's Republic. This part is important, very important to his ultimate assassination, which takes place just a few years after he moves to Kiev. Because when Mykola, Claudia, and their 2 young daughters moved to Kiev, this was right during the thick of the political turmoil between the Ukraine's push for independence and Russian rule. Russian Soviet communist socialist rule. Now, the October Revolution was an overthrow, basically, of the Russian government at that time. It was brief, but it was powerful. And the October Revolution was an attempt to end imperial rule by the Russians forever. This specific event is really what triggered the Russian Civil War. This trigger event gave the Ukrainian people, though, a very brief and exciting chance at independence. And through that brief and exciting period following the October Revolution, a group is born called the Ukrainian People's Republic. I have to say it was somewhat brief because, unfortunately, this same October Revolution that brought so much hope and joy to the Ukrainian people is also what ultimately led to the Ukraine being forcibly absorbed into the Soviet Union. But for a brief period of time, right after the October Revolution, is when Mykola's song debuts in Kiev. So this debut, the timing of his song debuting, being such an authentic Ukrainian folk song about the new year and about hope and about prosperity and joy and a bountiful crop, all of those themes, the timing was just perfect with the October Revolution. During this time, around 1918, 1919, Mykola had so much hope for this song, especially because under the Russian government, under the imperial rule that had just been overthrown with the revolution, the Russian government was severely restricting the playing of songs like this. So now, if the government is overthrown with this revolution, and he's living in Kiev, and so is Alexander, and they have these huge choruses, they can play the song wherever they want. Everybody can play the song. A child going to school can play the song outside, in his bedroom, and you can hear it from outside the window. That was his hope for this song in those weeks and those months. Now, I tried really hard to find letters that Mykola might have written, or any sort of telegram he might have written to Alexander or to the Kiev Conservatory during these years and these months, but it is really difficult to find any Ukrainian papers, letters, diaries, books, etc. Really hard to find anything from that time period because the Russians destroyed all of that. And this is actually something that really worries me about the way that we document things and keep so much digital nowadays. Because if you think about it, all it really takes is a click of the button to delete a digital archive. And with, Instagram and Facebook, it's so great to document your life. It's so wonderful. You want to document it. But anyone could just hack in and delete everything. All your photos, all your memories, all of your journal entries that were Facebook posts. People joke that people treat Facebook like a diary, but you should keep a diary. You should write about what's happening in your life. It should be documented. But look at what happened during this time. And it's happened in history time and time again. We saw it starting in 2020 with the censorship of certain voices, right? Trump literally got kicked off of Twitter. He wasn't allowed to speak on a platform because they didn't like what he was saying. And that is what makes America so unique, and what makes America the greatest country in the world is that we should not have that censorship. That's not part of our country's operations. And for a lot of countries, it is. Just a week or two ago, you saw people getting, not even a couple days ago, it happens every few days, somebody gets arrested in the UK because they said something on a YouTube video, or they said something on a post and they get arrested for it. So the Russians were doing this at that time. They were doing a lot of it. And back then, they had to burn the books. They couldn't just go in and click a button and hit delete and ban you from something. They had to take your books and burn them. They had to burn the letters. They had to shred the letters. And they were doing that. They had to try a little harder. It wasn't just a click of a delete button, but they burned a lot of the Ukrainian culture and publications during that time. And it is so, so sad. But they were successful at it. It was harder to do, took more effort, but they were successful at it. And at any rate, this is why I always encourage people to write things down. Write in a hardcover book. Print out your photos, handwrite things, and keep it and lock it up for your kids and your grandkids and whoever else might want some real insight into what was going on. So at this time, Mykola is seeing all of these books being burned. He's seeing all of this happening, right? But then the revolution happens and he's really excited. He and his family were becoming really passionate about the revolution and were really excited to see this new organization come about called the Ukrainian People's Republic. He and his family 100% supported their efforts for independence and religious freedom, not just for Ukrainian independence, but for maintaining the culture of the country through music. That's specifically what he was really passionate about. And like I said, he was never really a political force. He was never a political figure, but he was concerned and overwhelmed with this initiative of preserving Ukrainian culture through music. So, needless to say, moving to Kiev was not a comfortable move at first. It was not a move to a thriving capital, but he did have a period of excitement around 1918 and 1919. However, things began to take a turn for the worst pretty quickly. First of all, by the end of 1919 and the beginning of 1920, the Ukrainian People's Republic group began to collapse. Ukrainian culture institutions were being forced to shut down and be absorbed into a new rule, which would ultimately be called the Soviet Union. And this is where they started destroying all of the books and the letters and really amped up their efforts to erase Ukrainians from the face of the planet. And like I said, even though Mykola wasn't a soldier and wasn't associated directly with the Ukrainian People's Republic, he was still on the radar of the Soviets because he was openly associated with Ukrainian language and education and the Ukrainian Orthodox seminary programs. He was also very well known for his works. He wasn't just a nobody in the town. And this indirectly linked him to the Ukrainian independence movement. And to the Russians, anyone who was promoting Ukrainian identity was enough to mark you as dangerous. You just had to be Ukrainian and be someone people looked up to and someone who was making active efforts to maintain the Ukrainian lifestyle. Remember Alexander, the conductor who took on Mykola's song with his orchestra in Kiev? Well, he decided in early 1919 to establish a Ukrainian Republic a cappella group. That's literally what he called it. And this was a state-funded choir formed specifically for promoting Ukrainian music and culture abroad. And remember, this was early 1919, before the Soviet rule comes back and starts burning books and getting rid of everything. Like I said, it took a turn really, really quickly and really fast. But I forgot to mention that before that happened, not only was Mykola really excited about his song, but simultaneously, Alexander forms this other group specifically focused towards the Ukrainian Republic and the music. And this group obtained over 113 singers and musicians and was preparing for a European tour in 1919. This was all by the spring of 1919. So as soon as the Russian rule starts to come back at the end of 1919, this group was already established and already had tour dates and already had their cars booked and their train tickets to get out of Dodge, to get out of Russia and get out of Kiev and go on this musical tour. So the first tour destination, and by the way, this was not a small tour, this was huge. The first tour destination for this group was at the end of 1919 was Czechoslovakia, and then they went on to Austria, and then Switzerland, and then France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Great Britain, Germany, Poland, Spain. They were taking this song and other Ukrainian songs too. They were taking them international, whether the Russians liked it or not. And they had the freedom to sing these songs in other countries, the freedom that they didn't have in Kiev. By 1920, the song had now been played and sung internationally in a lot of these other countries. And although Mykola and Alexander really wanted to enjoy this international success, they really couldn't. They could, but they couldn't, because the international success of these Ukrainian songs and of Mykola's song Shchedryk also put Mykola and Alexander in extreme danger with the Russians. And they knew this. Well, I shouldn't keep saying the Russians. I should be more specific and call them the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were the political faction that was led by Vladimir Lenin, who seized power in Russia in 1917, and he later created the Soviet Union. He was the leader of the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik leaders were ethnically Russian, but you also had some Bolshevik leaders and members who were Ukrainian and Jewish and Latvian and other things. So what united them was their ideology, not their ethnicity. I should be more specific about that. This success of Alexander, the Ukrainian choir, and Mykola's song, this put both Mykola and Alexander in extreme danger and surveillance by the Bolsheviks. So much so that both of them, Alexander and Mykola, began plotting their move and escape from Kiev to America. Alexander was already exiled from Kiev in a sense because he was on tour with this group in all of these other countries. He was definitely on the Bolsheviks' list, on their hit list, but he wasn't local, and that really protected him. I don't know if he held an official residence in Kiev during this time or if he didn't. He hadn't moved to America yet, but he was talking about it. And he was definitely more protected than Mykola was because Mykola was still living in Kiev with his wife and his 2 children. He was still working at the Kiev Conservatory, but he was trying to keep as low a profile as he could. Early 1921, Mykola knew the success of his songs were putting his family in way too much danger, being in Kiev. He, at that time, really started plotting the details and logistics of this move to America. He started thinking about the move around 1920, but 1921, he's putting all the pieces together. He still needed to save up a little bit more money and work out like a few last-minute logistics, but he was almost there with everything around the end of 1921. So he decided around the end of 1921, he was finally ready to leave Kiev. And before getting to America, he was going to stop with his family and live at his parents' house for a while. So he decides to take his whole family and quietly relocate to his parents' home in Markivka. Markivka was about a 4 or 5 hour drive from Kiev. Markivka was still under Soviet rule, as Kiev was, so it wasn't complete freedom for Mykola and his family, but it was also still an escape from the city of Kiev. It was much more rural. His parents had more of like a farmhouse feel, and it was a much smaller town. So Mykola felt as though he and his family could really fly under the radar there, at least for a little bit of time before they made it to America. Not only did Mykola know that his family's town was still under Soviet rule, but he also knew that meant there were secret Soviet policemen everywhere. If the territory was under Soviet rule, there were secret undercover Soviet police there, even in the most remote and rural villages, and they were called Czechs. Now, these secret policemen were always listening and watching. They would go into barbershops and eavesdrop on conversations. They would go into town. They would just sit at a cafe and watch people who came and went. So even though it's not documented anywhere how the Czechs, the secret Soviet police, learned that Mykola was in this village, we can surmise, historians can surmise, that he really just either the secret police saw Mykola in town and recognized him, or they heard some kind of town gossip about how someone else had seen him at his parents' house or something to that effect. Mykola and his family go to the parents' home. This is in late 1921. They had a really wonderful Christmas and Shchedryk season. Remember, Shchedryk, the song, is the period, of that new year but before the Epiphany. The Epiphany in 1921 would have landed on January 19th. Obviously, with Mykola's ties to the priesthood and his father and his grandfather, This Orthodox tradition of the Epiphany was a very big deal to the family, a very holy day for them. 3 days after this holy day, someone comes up to Mykola's parents' home. It was a man who said he was a traveler passing through the area. He looked dirty, his shoes looked worn, and he said he was seeking shelter for the night. Now, this was really common, actually, especially if you lived in a rural area during that time. You would get travelers coming through who would need food or water or shelter. Mind you, this is way before Airbnb or hotels. So his parents didn't hesitate to help this man. They said, of course, come on in, gave him some soup, gave him some dinner. That's it. They had a spare room. A lot of times, travelers might leave some sort of money or some sort of goods after they stayed somewhere. So this was just really common practice. The traveler, on this occasion, stayed overnight in the house, and then around 3 or 4 a.m., he goes into Mykola's room and shoots him. He then sort of roughed up his room, making it look like he was robbing him, but he didn't kill anyone else in the house. It was only Mykola and not his wife, who was right there. But he tried to make it look like a robbery, and then he left. Now, no one knew who the assassin was, but it ultimately comes out that his name was Shchedryk. That was his last name. And this wasn't released to the public until nearly 70 years later in the 1990s. When this happened, and for nearly 70 years following, but when this happened, the Soviets insisted this was just a random robbery gone wrong. This was a common tactic by the Czechs. Remember, Czechs is the name for secret Soviet policemen. This was a common tactic. They often posed as travelers in rural areas. They preferred quiet eliminations like this in rural areas where there weren't a lot of witnesses. They also were known for commonly staging these executions to resemble ordinary crimes. By doing things this way, they avoided public outrage, martyrdom, and international scrutiny too. And yeah, immediately following this incident, and for nearly 70 years following it, the authorities insisted the killing was the result of a normal robbery, that the shooter was just an ordinary bandit, and they insisted there was no political motive behind this murder. But 70 years later, the classified files are released, and alas, the shooter was a confirmed Cheka operative. Very soon after Mykola's assassination, Alexander, his friend, made his formal move to New York City. It is so sad because Mykola died completely unaware of how big of an impact his song was about to have on the world. Mykola's death was no doubt part of a broader campaign to neutralize Ukrainian cultural leadership. But Alexander was convinced to carry on Mykola's legacy in the States. Alexander knew that outside the perimeter of the Soviet territories, the song Shchedryk was free to live. So he continued to play it on tour with the Ukrainian National Chorus in all of these other countries, and he also brought it in the set list when he moved to New York City. Soon after his move to New York City, he arranged to have the song premiere at the iconic Carnegie Hall in 1922, just a few months after Mykola's assassination. It was Saturday, October 7th, 1922, to be exact, and I found this article from the Republican newspaper out of New York. It's a robust article that details out the hype that surrounded this event. The headline reads in all capital letters, "Ukrainian choir comes to the auditorium." And then it goes on to say, the Ukrainian National Chorus, which will be heard in the auditorium Tuesday evening, made its American debut in Carnegie Hall, New York, Thursday evening. It was a tremendous reception. The house was sold out, and it was necessary to close the doors an hour before the concert, leaving 2,000 people who were waiting to get in denied entry. It went on to say that the press and the leading musicians of the country reiterated the extravagant praise that had been lavished upon the chorus by the European press. And, goes on to say, no less an authority than Walter Damrosch pronounced Alexander Koshetz, our guy Alexander, the leader of the chorus, one of the greatest conductors of modern times. And now he is here at Carnegie Mellon with Mykola's song Shchedryk. There were about 6 songs in the program that were all arranged by Mykola. The last arrangement in part 1 of the series was none other than our song Shchedryk. I found this audio now from the Shchedryk song done by the Ukrainian National Choir. It is dated 1922, and I want to play it now so that we can all feel like we were there. And also so that you can hear how similar, almost identical, this song is to Carol of the Bells. Now, the original lyrics of this song Shchedryk by Mykola begin by praising a bountiful evening, as in praising the time, that season that's right after the Feast of the Nativity in early January, January 6th or 7th, that period of time between January 6th or 7th and before January 19th, which was the Epiphany. They're praising that period of time specifically and wishing for a bountiful crop, for a prosperous new year. Then the song, that's how it starts off, but then it depicts sort of a really promising sign, like a foreshadowing almost. It depicts a swallow, a bird, flying into a house, which was a symbol of good luck at that time. And the bird flies in and he's chirping and he's calling out to the host of the home to show the host what's going on outside. Come look, come look. He says that the sheep have rolled over and the lambs are being born, a sign of fertility. He says that there will be prosperity and an abundance of crops and everything that is good. And I'm sure you can notice if you're reading it on the screen that at the end, the prediction also says something kind of funny to us now: you shall have a black-browed wife. Now, in Ukrainian folk language, this was a classic compliment. If you were called a black-browed wife, oof, you were like, oh, please, this whole thing. But it meant that you will have a very beautiful, if you said you will have a black-browed wife, you were saying you will have a beautiful, healthy, youthful, attractive, and strong wife filled with vitality and fertility and good fortune. And remember, this song, Shchedryk, was a New Year's song. So you're wishing all of these good things, not only on the person, but specifically on the person for that upcoming year. And even though 2,000 people were denied admission due to the show being sold out, one very important person did make it into the auditorium for the show. And that was a man named Peter J. Wilhowsky. Peter, I call him a man. Peter was only 20 years old when he came to this show and saw the Ukrainian National Choir perform this rendition of Mykola's song. I call him a man, but Peter was only 20 years old when he saw the Ukrainian National Choir perform this rendition of Mykola's song. Peter didn't understand Ukrainian, so he didn't really understand the lyrics, but he was a music student, so he understood a good composition when he heard one. After attending this concert, Peter just went on with his normal life and studies. Nothing dramatic happened right after this show, not even soon after. And the song Shchedryk just went on with the National Choir, went on being performed as such, and that was it. For nearly 10 years following this Carnegie Mellon concert, nothing changed. It wasn't until 10 years later, around the early 1930s, Peter was now around 31 years old and decided to go into a career in radio broadcasting. He joined NBC Radio as a music arranger and conductor and started working on choral programming and holiday broadcasts. And, serendipitously actually, he also started working on adaptations of traditional folk music. And this is where divine music intervention begins to intercede. Because through Peter's connections at NBC Radio, he had access to large audiences, professional choirs, and he had broadcast deadlines that demanded a very clear English language material. So he had deadlines he had to reach. He had to be paid to do this. He was very motivated in all of those senses of the word. Now, Shchedryk, the song, he had heard 10 years prior as just a little young 20-year-old at Carnegie Mellon. He remembered the beauty of Shchedryk and the beauty of the Ukrainian choir as they sung it. It was one of those things that just kind of hits you and stays with you. So in 1936, he is now working on these adaptations and working at the radio program, working at NBC. In 1936, he decides he's going to look up what that melody was and revisit it. But this time, he decided to make an adaptation of this older song, which is something he was doing quite regularly. Now, but this is 14 years, by the way, after that concert at Carnegie Mellon. 14 years later, Mykola's song gets a breath of new life through Peter. Peter was working on a holiday broadcast, and obviously, he decided, because of that, to change the lyrics to be more catered towards the American Christmas time frame and traditions. Also, like I mentioned, NBC required his songs be in English, so he had to change the words to English. And he could have just translated the words from Ukrainian to English, but he was also working on these holiday broadcasts, and he had to make it all fit. The authenticity of the song remained, as did Mykola's melody and composition. But the theme shifts slightly from a song that was originally focused on blessing a future to a song that is now more so making an announcement of a very holy moment. Rather than the song beginning with the announcement of Shchedryk, Shchedryk, Shchedrykova, it now begins, "Hark how the bells, sweet silver bells, are ringing." The bells ringing loudly are signifying this announcement of this holy moment and holy season, rather than before it was really just the choir announcing the Shchedryk season, and the bird flying into the house was symbolic of that announcement of goodness to come. Now, through Peter's connections at NBC Radio, he then plays the song on the broadcast to Americans everywhere that Christmas season. Not only did Peter have these ties to NBC Radio, but he also had local ties musically and was working as the director of music at a high school in Brooklyn, New York. Now, this year in 1936, there were multiple students from multiple high schools all over the New York area coming together to form one of the biggest orchestras and choruses that had ever existed in the New York area. The orchestra was set to be about 80 students and the choir over 180. So naturally, Carol of the Bells got radio play that season in 1936, which of course garnered national attention, but the song was also being taught and covered by all of these local students in the New York area everywhere for their upcoming concerts as well, which also gave it an incredible amount of local attention too, and also got people excited when they heard it on the radio and when they played it live because you had that correlation there. So the song is just absolutely booming in New York City in the Christmas season of 1936. Whenever Carol of the Bells was mentioned in newspapers or playbills, show pamphlets, it would always read as Carol of the Bells, and then in parentheses would say Ukrainian Carol, which we don't really see that anymore. Sometimes we do, but this was in every single mention of the song. You would see Ukrainian Carol next to it. And credit was always given and is still always given as Leontovych Wilhowsky, meaning Mykola and Peter together, since Peter Wilhowsky maintained everything original to Mykola Leontovych's original carol. He just simply changed the words. From 1936 onward, Peter J. Wilhowsky's legacy became inseparable from Carol of the Bells. After writing his English lyrics and publishing his choral arrangement that year, Wilhowsky continued working as a respected composer, arranger, and choral director, most notably, of course, with NBC, who he stayed with for several years. While Carol of the Bells steadily gained traction through radio broadcasts, school choirs, and Christmas programs, Wilhowsky did not aggressively pursue fame for the song. Instead, the song quietly embedded itself into American holiday culture, spreading year after year through performances and word of mouth rather than formal promotion. By the 1940s and 1950s, Peter's version had become a standard selection in Christmas music catalogs. The song was often performed with the audiences not even realizing that this was a modern adaptation of such an old and respected Ukrainian folk song. In the decades that followed the 1950s, Peter lived to see his arrangement eclipse his own name. Carol of the Bells every year grew more and more popular, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable Christmas melodies in the world. And Peter, during all of this, remained largely out of the spotlight. He continued his work in music and education and composition all the way up until he died in 1978. Now, sort of similar to Mykola, Peter knew that his song was doing really well, but he died before the song's massive pop culture explosion in various different films and commercials. Most notably, you might recognize the song from, well, I'll name a list. Here's a list. Home Alone in 1990, Home Alone 2, The Santa Claus in 1994, Jingle All the Way in 1996, The Polar Express, Harry Potter, Die Hard 2, I wonder if it's in Die Hard 1, Krampus, Better Watch Out, Mickey's Christmas Carol, A Christmas Carol, well, various adaptations of A Christmas Carol, various versions, amongst thousands and thousands more. Not to mention all the chorus and orchestra concerts that play it and love it. Love it for its minor key, first of all. We love a minor key, but also its four-note motif that just builds urgency while still holding this unexplained tension. It works as something that's equally holy. It's holy, ominous, nostalgic, and thrilling all at the same time. Even after Peter's death, his contribution endured. Peter was the bridge that carried a Ukrainian folk melody across continents and generations. Long after Peter's death, as modern audiences rediscovered the song's origins and restored credit to Mykola Leontovych, Peter's role became more and more clear, not as the composer of the melody, but as the voice that introduced Carol of the Bells to the world, a world that the song would ultimately conquer. If you like this type of content, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You also have the option to give the channel a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel and to this specific episode. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my